Good morning. My name's Simon Curran, and it's my privilege to be your host today for our latest update in the Spark Lab series. As always, the aim of Spark Lab is to provide you with a fast-paced, interesting briefing from some of the world's thought leaders, bringing practical tools and tips to help you improve your performance in your business as early as tomorrow. Today is a really special treat. Not only do we have a genuine world-class thought leader in her respected field, she's also a dear friend of mine, a lady by the name of Dr Anita Sands. Born in Ireland, Dr Anita is a true global citizen. She earned a PhD in atomic and molecular physics in Belfast before completing a master's in public policy. She's now a Fulbright scholar. She lectures at Princeton, and most importantly for the topic of today, she sits on the board of some of the world's highest performing, quickest growing, most innovative companies on the planet. Anita has a wonderful way to connect from the boardroom right the way down to the factory floor. And the topic we're going to be discussing today is this idea of belonging. What is it? Why is it important? Why do we get it wrong? What's the difference between belonging versus diversity and inclusion? You're about to come on a wonderful ride, and I'll take this opportunity now to bring in Anita, my good friend. It is great to see you again.
Hi, Simon, kia ora. It's so great to be with you here today, and thank you for inviting me on this incredible series. So delighted to be here.
Let's start with the first question. Help me understand, when we use the word belonging, what do we mean by it, and how is it different from inclusion and diversity?
You know, one of the reasons why I started talking about belonging was I was getting really frustrated about how little progress we were making on D&I, despite the fact that organizations were pouring millions and millions of dollars into this, lots and lots of time. So I kind of, as a physicist, I went back to first principles going, you know, why are we getting this so wrong? Why is it so hard? And I think I realized a few things about D&I that were sort of limiting the conversation. So first of all, when we started to talk about diversity and inclusion, we inevitably got down to kind of a couple of variables really early on. So we narrowed the conversation to be largely about gender or ethnicity. Whereas, you know, for a company that's seeking innovation and seeking, you know, to retain its competitive advantage, you really need a broad range of skills, a broad range of perspectives from a very diverse set of people. And that goes way beyond our gender or ethnicity. Like, there's so much that goes into shaping the worldview and the perspective, the experience, the voice that we bring to the table. So I kind of felt that was the first thing that was constraining the conversation. The second thing was that, you know, diversity is hard, and I don't think we necessarily give it its due, which maybe something we can come back to later in this conversation. So I sort of figured that we kept defining diversity and inclusion as a problem, whereas in fact I see it as a solution to a lot of things. In fact, if you really are going to be an innovative organization, if you're going to, you know, maintain a competitive stance in a landscape that is changing as rapidly as the one is that we live in today, then you have to have a continual kind of refresh of thinking and experiences and perspectives. I think one of our mutual friends, Simon, uses this great line where she says, if you're on a battlefield, it doesn't help to have everybody on the team look through the same set of binoculars. So I think that's where you know, starting to see diversity as a solution to remaining competitive and winning in today's climate is critical. And then the third thing was that I felt, while striving for diversity and inclusion is important and necessary, it's not sufficient to actually get all of the benefits that you think that diversity is going to bring you. So one way I sort of say it is that if diversity is a seed and inclusion is the crop, then belonging is how you harvest it. And, you know, you could add, let me say in my world, you know, you could add a woman to your board of directors, but if she doesn't feel that she belongs and she doesn't speak up, if she doesn't have that level of psychological safety, then you're never going to get the benefit of having a woman around the table, you know, to begin with. So there was a few things there that really inspired me to start thinking about an alternative way to frame this entire discussion. And that's what led me down the path to belonging.
Okay, so having heard that answer, Anita, and this runs the risk of sounding like a nonsense question, but if belonging was important before COVID, before the world flipped on its head, before we had distributed workforces, why is it more important now, and how is it different for what we're about to head into?
It's so important in a crisis. In fact, crises like the ones, you know, what we've experienced over the past couple of years are like a litmus test for belonging. Because, you know, outside of the workplace, we've all experienced this existential stress and strain. And people are now kind of coming to a point where they're asking, what's holding me here, right? Is work something that is a source of support and replenishment for me? Or is work something that is really an additional burden on top of all the burdens that I have in life? So that's kind of a part of why we're starting to see a lot of people reassess kind of their connection to the company. Second thing, Simon, is that we are seeing, at least in the United States, interesting numbers around attrition and retention for those who are pandemic hires, as we call them, so hired in the last couple of years versus those that were with the organization prior to that. And one of the reasons we believe that's true is because we haven't been able to form those bonds of belonging and that real kind of sense of collective, I know why I belong together with these people. That's harder to do when you're distributed. So it just makes belonging actually more important if you are going to try and hold on to retention, but, or retain these people. But also, existentially kind of what's going on is the following. When the pandemic first hit us and we were all sent home and, we were dealing with this sort of incredibly, new, unknown thing, and we didn't know how long it was going to last, everybody kind of just bunkered down, just said, okay, look, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to keep going at work here, and work tried to figure out how to, keep people as productive as possible. And, basically a way to think about it is that we were all running in this race. We got tripped up, but kind of through no fault of our own. And, some of us have sort of lifted our heads up, dusted ourselves off and just continued running. But a lot of people right now are lifting their heads up, dusting themselves off and going, why was I even in this race to begin with? Or why was I in this particular lane to begin with? I'm not sure that it's solving for everything that I want in life. I'm not going back to a 2-hour commute. I'm not going back to a difficult boss. I'm not going back to a culture where I feel like I have to fold myself like a pretzel to fit in all the time. I'm not going back to a place where I had to make all of these compromises around who I am and what I bring in order to just kind of pick up a paycheck at the end of the week. People's thinking has monumentally shifted. So, I was at an event a couple of weeks ago here and they were talking about the Great Resignation, and one guy sort of spoke up and he said, no, I think it's the Great Reassessment. And I think that's actually a more interesting way to think about what's going on, at least certainly in the US right now.
Anita, I want to go back to something you just made reference to there, and that is this distinction between fitting in versus to belong, because they are two commonly used phrases, but yet they're worlds apart. Can you help us understand the difference between those two?
Understand the difference between belonging and, say, inclusion, right? And even inclusion, you could argue, is not the same if you have to fit in. There's a difference between being genuinely included and having to really sort of alter yourself or leave parts of yourself at the door in order to fit in. So if we start by kind of decoupling these things, then I think we can understand the real fundamental difference between the two. So belonging to me, Simon, is when you do not have to check a big part of your story or yourself or your life or your identity at the door in order just to fit in, right? It's when you feel that you can bring your full authentic self to work every day, and that you can be the same person on a Monday afternoon with your colleagues as you were on a Sunday afternoon with your family. Now, I teach at Princeton, so I have these young, wonderful undergrad students, and when I talk to them about belonging, and I did this entire lecture on it, they said, but we are who we are, and of course these are the sort of next gen thinkers of and so sort of well versed, I guess, on a lot of this relative to certainly to me or maybe to prior generations. And they said, well, we are who we are, so why can't that just be accepted? And, we don't want to conform and we don't want to fit in. And I said, yeah, but let me just reframe what I said about Sunday afternoon and Monday afternoon. If you're out kind of in a nightclub or a bar on a Saturday night, and then you're in church with your parents on Sunday morning, is it the exact same version of you that shows up in both of those contexts? Or is it a sort of more appropriate version of you in one setting versus another? And of course, their answer was, well, yes, of course. And that's the difference, right? Is that being your authentic self is actually being yourself, skillfully. So there's a difference between feeling that you can be yourself, and we all have kind of an elasticity and a bandwidth to our personalities and to our styles. And for those of us who have kind of high emotional intelligence, and you can sort of, understand a context, you can understand a culture, and then you can sort of behave as yourself, but appropriate for that context. That's a big part of what belonging is about as well. So it's not just sort of a black and white, all or nothing kind of thing. Either I fit in, I belong, or I don't. We all sort of modestly have to kind of be our authentic selves, but do so with skill. And that's a big difference then. So really the main difference between belonging and inclusion is not just that you can bring your full authentic self, but it's also that you feel you get to co-create the thing to which you belong. And that's the big difference. So Simon, maybe I'll just share a little sort of anecdotal story that will help explain that more. So let's assume, Simon, I'm having a party, for instance, to celebrate Ireland's victory over the All Blacks in the rugby, like just hypothetically speaking. And I'm having this party, say, hey Simon, you and all my friends from New Zealand are welcome. But here's the shtick. It's my party, it's my playlist, it's my guest list. I'm going to decide the music, I'm going to decide, what's served. And whenever the party's over, you don't have to go home, but you will be asked to leave. Now, so you're very welcome, Simon, and you're definitely included. But do you feel like, you belong in that case versus if you and I were co-hosting a party and we made all those decisions together and you really felt that you had agency in the design and the execution of the party as much as I did, that's a much different feeling. So belonging is when you get to co-create the thing to which it is you belong, as opposed to saying, here's the thing, here's our organization, it's just here, and now you have to do what you need to do in order to fit in. That's the big difference between the two.
Okay, so let's just back up into this concept a little bit, because one of the amazing things about you, Anita, is you sit on the board of some of the world's most successful, fastest growing organizations, some of them well into their hundreds of thousands of employees. So help me understand, how could little old me, humble me, play a role co-creating or co-contributing to the culture of an organization like that? And I mean that question for large organizations as much as I do for small organizations. Help us really practically understand co-creation.
You know that old adage, people join companies and leave managers, right? Like belonging, the magic happens at the team level. A lot of this happens at the team level. In the relationship, the most important relationship that any employee has is the relationship with his or her manager. But one of the things, so managers have a lot to do here, and we can come back to that in a second. One of the things that I love about belonging, one of the things I find most powerful about belonging is that this is not a top-down edict. This is not something that kind of is pushed down from corporate HQ. There's a lot that we can do ourselves as individuals to create a culture of belonging. So let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, we're going to have a much higher sense of belonging, Simon, if I simply know who you are, right? So belonging is predicated on trust and acceptance. And, Brene Brown has this line that it's very hard to hate people up close. So one of the ways that we build that vulnerability and trust, and important, of course, to remember that vulnerability precedes trust, not the other way around, is to be vulnerable ourselves, right? So to tell our story of origin, to share a little bit about our family, our background, who we are outside of work, and getting to know the other people that, our colleagues as people, as humans outside of the job, that's sort of part of the foundation where you start to build this sort of sense of vulnerability, this sense of trust. So that's one of the first things we can do. The second thing we can do is really speak openly about mistakes, right? So if a manager makes a mistake, it's so important that he or she speaks openly about it, because then you have a team that can all learn from the mistake, and you're sort of opening up those lines of communication and collaboration. So belonging is going to be present whenever people feel that they don't have to act in their own self-interest, but rather that they can communicate openly and candidly with each other. And again, I mean that as appropriate in the cultural context and with skill, but then again, managers have to set the example for that. So certainly knowing who people are, communicating with openness and honesty, showing people that they are valued. And people then often ask me, well, Anita, how would you show somebody that they are valued or that they belong? And I'm like, well, what would make you feel valued, right? What could be a little thing that one of your colleagues or team members or that your boss could do that would make you feel valued, right? This sort of psychic comp, as I like to call it. And when you start to ask people, if it was acknowledging that, if they knew one of my kids was home sick, say, listen, just take off the rest of the day. If your team members or your boss help you to reprioritize your work or reset deadlines, if you really are under a period of stress or strain at home, that's showing that you're valued. That's showing that they cared. Even little things, Simon, like if I ask you, hey, Simon, how are you doing? Tough few months, right? And you go, oh, yeah, I'm doing all right. And I go, yeah, but Simon, like, how are you doing today? If on a scale of 1 to 10, if 1 is you're just barely hanging in by the skin of your teeth, and 10 is you're walking on air, you're so good, where are you today? And somebody did that for me recently where they asked that question. And while generally speaking, I would say I'm doing fine and I'm probably a 6 or a 7 or an 8, that particular day, my daughter hadn't slept the night before. and I literally was awake all night. So I was just dragging that day. I was low on fuel. The gas tank was on yellow. And I just said, actually, today I'm a little closer to a 3 or a 4, right? So, but I was really intrigued by the fact that the person asked that question with that level of specificity and detail, because it actually allowed me to tell them about the lack of sleep I'd had the night before and the tough time I'm going through with my daughter. And that's how you show caring. That's how you show that sense of acceptance, that sense of you're valued. We care about you as a human. That's the bond of belonging.
I think if I'm honest, Anita, I'm probably still getting my head around the idea of a party about the Irish rugby team. But sort of that aside, so one of the incredible things I've learned recently working with the New Zealand Black Fern Sevenside is the construct by which they do a one-on-one. And they do that asking 4 very simple questions. How are you? Now, how are you really? How are we? And what's one thing that I can do to help you improve your performance? I just love the fact that something as so important as this idea of making someone feel like they belong could come down to the brilliance of the simplicity of 4 questions. But Anita, where I want to go next is there'll be some people listening to today's session, hearing words like vulnerability and trust, and perhaps thinking these are nice things, but they're quite soft things, and they belong in certain departments or certain organizations, but not mine. But yet what we've both found is that this idea of belonging and vulnerability is at the heart of high performance. This idea that to belong means accepted for who I am, but expected for me to be at my best. So can you help the listeners here today get a grasp on why is belonging such an important ingredient in high performance?
So I sort of talk about 3 forms of belonging. There's cultural belonging, which sort of what we would think about in the D&I sort of realm. And that's the sort of stuff that does feel a little HRE and warm and fuzzy, right? But cultural belonging basically is predicated on the 2 things I just spoke about, acceptance and trust, right? So that's sort of the foundation of it. Then we move to sort of getting into the how does belonging enable high peak performance and competitiveness and innovation. So that you're getting into functional belonging, then belonging at the team level. And that comes down to 2 things. First of all is, what we'll describe as just utmost clarity of purpose. Do you know why you belong together as a group of people? You're not a random set of people just walking around the planet that happen to find themselves in the same Zoom meeting, right? So really reinforcing for people that orientation towards the mission of the company, right? You're not coming to work to do a job, you're coming to work to fulfill a mission, and you're doing that as a group of people together. That's sort of how you start to get this functional belonging at the team level. And then the second part of functional belonging is this, what I call sort of your foundation, your shared values, your spine of beliefs. So this is when you talk about your organizational values and where we've made mistakes with that in the past is we've said, here are our values. We value integrity. We value honesty. We value innovativeness. We value creativity. We value collaboration. We value partnership. And we're going to put all these nice words on the wall. But then when the rubber hits the road, if those values live differently than they read, then you start to the cracks emerge in the belonging foundation. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you a practical example. I worked on Wall Street for a decade, and we would have the values on the walls in some of the organizations I worked at, and then you would see the organization bring in these very senior guys from other shops who weren't known for those values, right? So like people that were known for maybe not being collaborative, being very harsh, very competitive, very tough, maybe not high integrity. And you sort of go, hang on a second, like, didn't we just say we're all about integrity? And then we gave this guy kind of one of the top jobs, like, seriously? So when people start to see, or if, I was talking to a lady in a law firm and she talked about how they had values in their organization, but then if a certain partner was a rainmaker, he or she, let things slide in terms of their behaviors or the appropriateness of their behaviors relative to the values. If you start to let things slide like that, people just start to, the belonging starts to fall apart. People go, something, you've eroded my trust because you said these are the values, but I am seeing different behavior being rewarded, different behavior being reprimanded. And therefore I don't buy it anymore. So that's where you start to get into functional belonging, is really understanding, do you know why you belong together as a team? And then having a set of values that you live by, that everybody trusts in, right? So this idea of trust and be trusted. But to get to the sort of peak performing teams, and Simon, I love the work, I did with you and your team a couple of years ago in studying the All Blacks, for instance. I did not expect them to be talking about belonging. And it was just amazing to hear how they think about it. But they have this idea of, you belong and you make better, right? So you're going to belong to this team, but you have then a responsibility. It's a two-way street to make this organization better, to make this culture better. So we're almost back to your loop concept there, Simon. And I love one of the lines that they always said about is, the legacy is more intimidating than any opponent. Ireland notwithstanding, but that's really the holy grail of this stuff. When you feel that you belong to a team, to an organization, they're all very clear about the purpose that they serve as one. They're very clear about how they're going to go about their game when they hit the field. But more importantly, they know that they belong in order to make this better and to leave that legacy and the jersey in better shape than they found it. So that's when you really start to see this at a super elite, high performing level. And when you have that kind of sense of belonging embedded in your culture, it unleashes people. People are free to be themselves, to take risks, to put a crazy idea on the table, to stand up against management if they think management are rowing in the wrong direction. People will go after innovative ideas because they're like, hey, I can do anything here, and I'm not going to be judged or I'm not going to be criticized if I really am giving it my best shot. So that's when you start to see this appear in the business world in terms of driving innovation. I like to say to companies in Silicon Valley, like, belonging is the gateway through which innovation has to pass. Because if people don't feel they belong, they'll play small, they'll act small, they'll be wasting all of their cognitive energy trying to fit in and trying to do things that won't leave them feeling judged or criticized. So having that sense of psychological safety, that sense of psychological freedom, that is what allows people to unleash their capabilities, to do their best, to be their best, as you said, Simon, and that's where companies really start to derive the value.
What you just said there, Anita, reminds me of a great comment from Gilbert Enoka, that is that it's aspirations that get us going, but it's a shared purpose that keeps you going. So help me with this, Anita. If belonging is so important, if it's about people feeling safe, if it's a natural place for us to be, if it's encouraging and unlocking the potential of others, if it's such an important ingredient of high performance, why then do so many teams and so many leaders get it wrong?
I think a large part of it, Simon, is we don't get to the conversation about belonging. We have a conversation about diversity and inclusion. And as I said in my opening remarks, that's very limiting for a lot of different reasons. And when we start down the path of talking about D&I, people do think it's an HR thing. They do think it's a check the box thing. They do think it's about hiring, a certain quota of diverse people. So we're sort of down the wrong path to begin with. Whereas I think when we start talking about belonging, that transcends the D&I conversation, right? Because you can be a white man sitting around a table full of white men and not feel that you belong for a lot of different reasons. So we are wired as human beings to want that sense of belonging. And so one of my good friends, a great thought leader in this space, Pat Waters, she was the former CRHO at LinkedIn and ServiceNow, and she's now at Procore. So she was sort of known for coining this phrase, DIBS, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And Pat said what led her down the path of thinking differently was that somebody asked her how did she feel about D&I, and she'd never been asked how she felt about D&I. She'd always been asked what she thought about D&I. So she realized then that D&I kind of captured her head as an HR person, but belonging captured her heart as a human being. She understood what we were after then. So I think that's part of the reason why we find it so hard, is that we sort of frame the conversation in the realm of D&I. We frame it as a problem to be solved as opposed to a solution. And we don't sort of start at the fundamental human level here, at the team level and at the individual level. So I think that's where, initially we sort of get off on the wrong foot, to be honest, Simon.
Anita, I love the reference between head and heart, because what we know that although that's only 30 centimetres apart, for some it may as well be a continent. But I want to go back to two words you used earlier, psychological safety and psychological freedom. Help us understand the distinction between them both and why they're both so critically important today.
But I mean, how would you deliver if you weren't at your best, right? Like that's one of the things. If everybody is not at their best, you're going to have a suboptimal outcome, right? So it behooves you to create a space where people can be at their best, just by definition. The second thing, Simon, is that, if the last 2 years have taught us anything, is that, we are dealing with a huge degree of ambiguity in the business context nowadays. And that's not going away anytime soon, because the pace of change is accelerating, right? So diversity is what gets you through adversity. You cannot be prescriptive about how to do things because you don't know how to do things in a global pandemic. I don't know about you, Simon. I'd certainly never lived through one before. So we were all in this kind of, known, unknown, whatever way you might want to frame it. So the difference, just going back, psychological safety is feeling, really that safe enough to be yourself, to speak out, to contradict kind of the conventional thinking. Again, doing so appropriately and with respect and so forth, but not feeling that you are going to be penalized or criticized, or treated harshly if you are the one that speaks out. Secondly, psychological freedom, though, is very different. It is the belief that you don't have to prove yourself every single day, right? That you're going to be given the benefit of the doubt because you have shown up consistently over time. And we really started to see both of these phenomena coming under immense pressure in the last year, and it all came down to how managers were treating employees. So let me give you an example of what I mean. We're starting to see really interesting data. The McKinsey Women in the Workplace report, this year, for instance, I had that team come and present at my class at Princeton, and they talked about a big difference in employee satisfaction and employee retention, / attrition rates if the manager showed a caring for that employee's well-being in the past year. And when you sort of double clicked on what does it mean well-being, it's not just asking about how are you doing or being mindful of the people's mental health, but it's very practical things like helping them to reorganize their work, helping them to reorganize deadlines, and not leaving people feeling in any way that they can't take time off, right? That they can't take, if we say, Simon, we've got flexible work hours, but then I sort of expect you to be always on, that is now leading to a whole ton of burnout, which I think is a big kind of precursor to the sort of great reassessment, which we talked about earlier. But if we say, Simon, we have flexible policies here, we have flexible work, I'm going to evaluate you on the results. I'm not evaluating you on how much face time you put in, how long I think it takes you to do the work. I just want to see the work getting done in the way that you see fit. And I'm going to encourage you, Simon, because we have flexible work hours, to actually put blocks of personal time on your calendar. I want everybody on the team to do that. Blocks of personal time. I'm the boss. I'm going to do that myself. And so again, we're back to this idea of the boss setting an example. And we're back to this idea of people feeling that they can speak up and say, hey, I got to take an afternoon off. I got to take care of my parents down the road, or I didn't sleep last night because, the kids, whatever, or I got to do a bit of the homeschooling stuff right now. What we're starting to see in the research coming out of the last couple of years is that a lot of employees, women in particular, working moms in particular, were feeling very reluctant to speak up. They were feeling very reluctant to say that they were struggling at times. They weren't sure their manager would understand. We are seeing data that says, look, we're really feeling like we have to be always on. So this sort of idea of psychological safety and psychological freedom of not having to prove yourself, those were really tested in the last couple of years. And I think we're starting to see some, significant divergence in how managers dealt with this in the data that's coming through now.
Let's just dwell for a little bit on this idea of not having to prove yourself, because Anita, there'll be people listening today that either work in or for or have in the past organizations and leaders who think it's their role to keep people on their very edge. This notion of, if I don't prove myself, maybe that means I'm complacent, and if I'm complacent, maybe that delivers softer performance. So help us understand this notion of kind of, I guess, a culture of fear versus a culture of freedom to perform.
First of all, again, I just never think you're going to get to peak productivity through a culture of fear. You simply just can't kind of whip people in that direction. It just doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work over the long term. I'm going to speak, Simon, just to give you a practical example about a leader I really admire when it comes to exactly your question. That's Bill McDermott, who's the CEO of ServiceNow. And prior to joining us at ServiceNow, he was the CEO of SAP. And Bill has a great line. As you know, I like to have these little wisdom cards that I post on social media, and many of them come from Bill. But Bill has this great line where he says, "Because I listen without judgment, people speak without fear." And that just goes, that is sort of sort of symbolic of his entire leadership style, which is and he believes that there's really no limit to how far your organization will go, how far you'll go, if you're willing to help other people get to where they want to go. So he sort of leads with this entire spirit of generosity and empathy. And frankly, the results speak for themselves. I mean, as a board, when we were, recruiting a successor for John Donahoe, who was leaving to go to Nike, we were like, how do you find a successor for John Donahoe? And, Bill came on hit our radar screen, and we started to do our due diligence as a board, and we looked at, Glassdoor rating of 99% when you've over 100,000 employees. I mean, it's just unheard of. But Bill's way of leading when he came to ServiceNow is he said, "I'll tell you what my vision is here, guys. I'll tell you why I've joined your corner. Is I want to create the defining enterprise software company of the 21st century." And everybody thought, wow, that's fairly grandiose. But he said, "That's my dream. Now I want you to tell me what your dream is. What do you want?" And he also has this other great line where he says, if you ask somebody what they want and you listen to their answer, you'll know practically everything that you need to know about them. So he encouraged all 13,000 employees to start to dream really big. And they said, if we chase our dreams together and we create the defining enterprise software company of the 21st century, guess what? All of your dreams will come true, because this company will be so successful and this stock price will increase so much that you'll be able to pay your mortgage off. You'll be able to pay for your kids' education. You'll be able to take care of your family. You'll be able to do all of the things that you dream and aspire to. So I could not believe how I was personally moved by that, but I could see it across 13,000 people. All of them suddenly were connecting their personal life aspirations and dreams to their work at ServiceNow and to our collective success at ServiceNow. And it wasn't just, we're going to go and sell software and the company will grow. This was like, we're on a mission together to create this industry century defining company. And by doing that, my personal dreams are going to come true. That is basically the antithesis of what you sort of laid out there as sort of how do you lead by fear. And I can tell you where I place my bets in terms of investing in a stock that's going places is when you have 13,000 people motivated in that way to that extent.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it makes me think how much of the way that we show up is not even a conscious decision that's the way we're showing up. Gallup research company published some data recently, didn't they, out of the US, saying that most employees, most days, are showing up and only providing 40% of themselves. They're working full days, but only accessing but a small portion of their potential. So I want to move from there, Anita, into now getting some very practical tools and tips. And the framing for this I want to talk to is belonging cues. This idea of how do you help people understand what it means to belong in this environment. Owen Eastwood, a New Zealand author, wrote a book recently called Belonging. And in it, he talked a lot about this idea of an us and them narrative. And he said that the role of the leader is to cast the us narrative as wide as possible. So it's not us as the exec versus someone else, or sales versus marketing, or us versus customer. As broad a definition of us as is practical. So in your experience, share with us now some really practical, best-in-class examples of what it means to help people belong.
Like I said, Simon, this is where we'll get into the practicality of what managers need to do here, right? Because belonging, that the magic does happen at the team level. So first of all, we're looking to create a culture of belonging, irrespective of how diverse the team is. But obviously, a lot of people are trying to strive to have diverse teams and then create, a culture where everybody, regardless of where they come from, what their background is, what their gender, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic history, whatever, pick any number of variables you want, but where they feel that they belong. So let's go back to a couple of the fundamentals here. First of all, acceptance and trust, right? So how, as a manager, can you show people that they are accepted? So little things like, hey guys, HQ are looking for our division's input on the strategy. I'd love to know what everybody thinks about it. I worked on it all weekend, actually, and this is sort of where I came out. Now, if I do that as a manager, what are the chances that you're going to, Simon, speak up and go, actually, boss, despite the fact that you worked on it all weekend, I think you're totally off base in terms of what you just said, right? So you can see how the manager, just in framing something that way and being the first to speak, managers should always be the last to speak. You're shutting down the notion that I'm accepting your opinions. I want to hear them. They're valuable to me, right? So how you frame something is sort of a way that you can open up a conversation as opposed to shut down the conversation. So that's a sort of very practical thing where you can show people, yep, your opinions are valued, and I'm accepting of those opinions because I'm going to listen to them. So asking for somebody's opinion and then listening to their answer is a big way, and being present as a senior person, not on your phone, not doing email on Zoom, being present, actually showing people that you value their time, you value their input, you value their contribution. So that's first and foremost. And obviously then communicating to them if they've done a good job, thanking them for their efforts, all of those kind of, just practical things. So that's very important on the first thing. Second of all, let's go back to the functional belonging. How are the values lived? What behaviors are rewarded and reprimanded? I think that's a fairly obvious one that most people can figure out. But the slippery slope is sort of the thing you want to avoid there, and clearly leading by example as a leader. Second thing, though, is you have to really reorientate everybody right now back to the mission of the company, right? To get this functional belonging. Why do we belong together as a team? How are we going to operate as a team? And I know, Simon, you have some amazing stuff that you've done around team dynamics and how teams actually explicitly have these conversations. But reorientating everybody around the mission is important. And coming into year end, let me explain how a manager can do that very, very tactically, is to remember that every single person on your team deserves the dignity of understanding clearly how they contribute to the masterpiece that is 2022, right? The masterpiece of your team's work next year. Everybody deserves the dignity of knowing exactly how they contribute to the masterpiece that is next year's work. That's how you kind of start to really reorientate people and attach people to the mission and to the broader purpose. And then I think on the other front, it's sort of some of the things we talked about, getting to know people, introducing people by more than their title, getting to know about them as a human being, not just sort of in a work context, ensuring that you are as open and transparent, not just about things like mistakes that are made on the team and everybody having the chance to learn about that, Simon, but also being open and transparent, say, about how promotions happen in your organization. So this is a big stumbling block in companies in Silicon Valley. So high growth companies, scaling rapidly, adding a lot of new people, promoting a lot of people. And one of the things you start to hear that frustrates people a great deal is, I don't believe our promotion process is transparent. I don't believe it's objective. I think if I put in more FaceTime, or if I manage to go and play a round of golf with the boss, that I'm the one more likely to get promoted. I think if I get stretch assignments, that helped me be promoted. And it does, right? So research has shown that, access to stretch assignments, access to developmental relationships, and exposure are the three critical ingredients that people need in order to be promoted, right? Those who are promoted in any organization are never unknown. So managers can do an awful lot, Simon, to create this sense of, I'm valued, I'm accepted, I contribute to this team, and I have a future here, right? Belonging is when you feel nurtured and stretched. So you want people to feel that they have a trajectory inside your company. And one of the ways you do that is by ensuring that you have as much transparency and objectivity around the promotion process. And that means you have to then sort of dig back in behind, how do people get stretch assignments? How do people get exposure in your organization? And how do they get access to developmental relationships? So by that, I mean mentors, sponsors, and the like. So I hope there's some sort of it's a smorgasbord of various things that managers can do at various levels, all of which help to create this sort of culture of real belonging.
And let me just reinforce a couple of things there. The notion that everyone deserves the dignity to know how they contribute. Suddenly you've elevated this from the compliance of a job spec to almost on how could you cruelly not provide that, which therefore is less about what you do, but why it matters. So I really love that. Also, this notion of really getting to know someone. One of the very senior leaders that we do a lot of work with will talk about the fact that they go looking for each of their directs, 2 examples of that. How the heck do they know that? Which is not about what you do or what you drive. It's like, how do they know that I'm into West Indian cricket? Like, how did that show up? And that's a demonstration of letting someone know just how much they care. And as an example of another book, Daniel Coyle wrote that stunning book called Culture Code, in which he hit something that you've just talked about there. The importance for every leader to let every person know you are safe, you are part of this team, and we have a future together. And I think it's a really interesting litmus as we go into our next interactions with people to let them know how often are we giving people the cue that you are safe, you are part of this team, and we have a future together.
Sorry, one thing that I saw done at one of my companies by one CEO, and he's what I'll call a level 5 servant leader. I mean, literally one of the best in the world. He shared, so one of the best CEOs in the world, right? So first of all, he always believed he could be better next year than he was last year. He always came in and said to the team, do all of you want to be world-class kind of business people? And they were like, yes, of course, And he was like, right, well, if you were a world-class golfer, wouldn't you have a coach for everything? Wouldn't you be continually improving your game? Wouldn't you be investing in improving your game? Yes, of course. And he's like, right, well, we're going to do the same here. And he had that mentality of always, that curiosity and that kind of continual learning and continual improvement mindset. He himself demonstrated, so that infused that into the organization. He then shared his developmental plan with his team, and his team of directs shared their developmental plans with each other. So as you put together, when we're talking about everybody understanding and having deserving the dignity to know how they contribute to the plan for next year, everybody had their objectives, right? Their business objectives, whether it was P&L objectives or whatever it might be. And then people had leadership developmental areas that they were going to work on, and they shared it with each other. So that, Simon, just builds on what you just said about, we're here and we're investing in you, and you're invested in this process as much as anybody else because we've actually shared our development plans with each other. That is very, very powerful stuff. Covers the vulnerability element that we talked about, requires a high degree of trust, right? You're starting to build this east-west muscle across a team where everything doesn't have to go north to the leader in order for a decision to be made. You're really starting to embed belonging. And just think about the difference between, I have a set of objectives for the year that you are my colleague, Simon, but you don't know what my objectives are, and I don't know what your objectives are. But I know I'm going to fulfill mine, right? Because my bonus at the end of next year depends on it. Imagine that versus, I know what yours are, you know what mine are, I know what you're trying to develop on as a person, you know what I'm trying to develop on as a person, and we're going to work together to help each other out to do that. That's a different ballgame altogether.
The very notion of better next year than you were this year. Another way of framing that, I guess, what would need to be true for 2022 to be your best year yet? And rather than writing in silence, what if actually the gift that you're talking about, the contagiousness of how you can make people feel like they belong, feel like they are safe, feel like they are valued. And I love the point you've made reference to a couple of times. We seem to confuse this relationship between trust and vulnerability. We think, I'll be vulnerable when I trust you first, but you've talked a lot today, Anita, about flipping that order. What happens if you're vulnerable, and boy, you wait and see what happens to trust. So you have hit some incredible points here today. We could go for another 40 minutes and still only be scratching the surface. I want to take this opportunity as you and my good friend to say thank you. Thank you very much for making the time. There's some wonderful practical tips and tricks. And as we think about what now is 3 weeks till Christmas, how might we in our daily interactions help people feel just that little bit more like they're included, like they belong here, so they can play their best game possible.
Just ask yourself, what would it take for you to feel a greater sense of belonging? And then try to think about whether you can just give one other person one moment like that between now and Christmas, between now and the end of the year, right? It's not rocket science. So I think I think everybody could actually move the dial on this in the 3 weeks you just mentioned.
So Anita, on behalf of everyone that's had the pleasure of watching this session today, a huge thank you for us. You've helped us understand it beautifully.
Simon, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight to see you, my friend, as always. And I wish everybody, all my good friends in New Zealand, a really wonderful holiday season and every health and happiness for next year. And go All Blacks.
And to all of you that have dialed in to enjoy today's session, a huge thank you to you. You know, this whole series began by one Spark customer saying, it'd be great if we could do something like this, and another Spark customer agreed. And how we are today, close to our 400th episode. So enjoy your day. Hopefully there was something practical you could use from today's discussion. We can't wait to see you back here for another session. Whatever.